So Steve Duncombe and Jean Rhea are members here at Judson. They live on Cape Cod during the summer. And Steve is the professor of arts and activism at the Gallatin School at NYU, and Jean teaches social media there. They have two children in our Sunday school, Sydney, age 15, and Seb, age 13. And Warren and I were able to be with them at the early part of this week at their lovely place on the Cape, and Micah and Matt are there now. How many people get two pastoral visits in 1 week? Oddly, the calendar just required that, given that they have a lovely guest house, and that's all I can tell you. So every morning, they have a ritual to this living on the Cape, and every morning they take their new lab golden lab, down to the beach and run it around for an hour. And then both boys have to read something between 9 and 10. And so we decided we would do the same thing. We would also take the dog down to the beach and read something between 9 and 10. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. So we're down on the beach with the dogs, and it's beautiful, of course. And Steve, who is a great collector of junk, finds a beautiful, distressed piece of wood that's this long and very flat. And he says, "Oh, this is great. It's just the size I need for that shelf I'm going to build in the back." And Sydney says, "Oh, God, you have 15 pieces of wood already. Why do you need this one?" And he said, "No, this one is wormy in just the right way. And it's been distressed so well that it's going to make a beautiful shelf when finished." Walking back up the hill, Sydney, again, age 15, starts batting. He was carrying the wood, of course. That's what a son should do. He starts banging it up against rocks. And Steve says, "Really? Don't do that. You'll get it distressed in the wrong way. You'll have it be wormy in different ways than it was when it landed here. And as a historian, I, your father, am telling you, never let something get wormy twice. Get it back to its original worminess so that you can really appreciate it." I thought that was the weirdest argument I ever heard. It seems to me there's, one worm after another as a general way of looking at life. But Steve was making a really interesting argument. And the argument was that the original distress needs to be experienced long enough so that you begin to tell a story about it, and it becomes the story of how you triumphed over that original distress. And it turns into not just a shelf, but a shelf with a story about your distress. And that's when I started thinking about this dilemma I have of why, in the name of God, did it take from July of 1848, Seneca Falls, calling for the women's right to vote, until August 18 of 1920 to get it? What was going on all those years? Was Sydney banging the thing up against the wall? Or was it stuck on a shelf waiting to be put to use? I mean, did we really need to wait that long for the women's right to vote? Wasn't it obvious that women were human beings and should vote? Wasn't it obvious that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was right when she said, "The greatest block today in the way of women's emancipation is the church, canon law, the Bible, and the priesthood"? To make laws that man cannot and will not obey serves to bring all law into contempt. How could you respect a constitution that only men could vote in? And she then also says, how can women possibly obey laws in which they do not participate informing. Good arguments, right? And I could go on and on and on. She was brilliant, and she was right. And she was right in 1848, but nobody noticed it for real until 1920. Obviously, I'm setting this up to help us have some patience for the Supreme Court, because there's such a parallel to the issues around women's reproductive justice and the right to vote. And don't they also stem from exactly the same issue? You know, Stokely Carmichael said he could only say the words constitute because that was the 3/5 way of getting to it. Why were women kept out for so long? So as I go into the three things I want to talk about regarding the right to choose an abortion, which I do believe is a right, and I also believe it's right, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. If you yourself would never have an abortion because you don't think it's right, if you yourself really feel that choosing to have an abortion is wrong, please, absolutely no disrespect intended. Zero. I am interested in creating a platform where women who do choose to have an abortion can have one. And as we know, that right is under threat. So first, I want to just review these scriptures and say a little bit about what they mean. Secondly, I want to do a little historical review of what was going on with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her spirit. And third, I want to theologize about the law and what it means today for us. So the Deuteronomy passage, first of all, choose life so that you and your children may live a long time. One scholar after another goes through Deuteronomy and says that this is a summation of the 30 previous chapters. It is not an individual exhortation. It has to do with helping the tribe of Israel who fled Egypt, were in the middle of their mess, they're wandering in the desert, to please hang on and imagine that you're going to choose life for the tribe. That's what the passage is about. It says that choosing life is better than choosing a renewed assimilation or going back together. There just is no way that life cannot include choice. And what the scripture is saying is choose life, choose hope, choose your tribe, choose to carry on with your life. It couldn't possibly be about abortion because they didn't know what reproductive technology knows now, which is that abortion is a safe and relatively harmless procedure. Psalm 139, continuing, is really one of the most beautiful ones of all. For you created me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. There's no question that when an abortion occurs, a fetus is aborted. Something beautiful. Something is gone. Something is lost. That's real. And something is gained. A woman gains her life. An adult human being is more important than an infant. Number one, you can keep having more children. Number two, a child that is not wanted is destined to have a really rough life. So there are exceptions, of course, but the destiny is so aborted. And the trouble goes on for year after year after year. When the psalmist was praising God for making tiny, beautiful life, the psalmist was praising God, not talking about protecting every fetus that ever comes along. And finally, the revenge passage. I mean, it's got its own sexism, God knows. You know, you pay the husband for the damage to the wife. It's really interesting. Talk about not being able to vote. Imagine that. But that repeated sense of revenge, it's an exchange. A lot of people will say that if a woman aborts a fetus, she's going to be damned to hell forever, right? Is that morally proportionate? I don't think so. We speak often of tremendous injury. We even speak of people who have murdered receiving the forgiveness of God, of people who have raped receiving the forgiveness of God. We do not see limits on the forgiveness of God except for women, constitute. So the root of this problem of abortion, moving on, is the dehumanization of women, the dehumanization of adult women, and the consequent and collateral damage to children who are unwanted coming into the world. It is a marvel of God's great goodness that reproductive technology, abortion, contraception, morning after pills allow us to plan parenthood as mature individuals. It is our God-given responsibility as adult humans, and women are not exempt from those kind of choices. We simply are not. We are capable of making those choices, and we're just as great a sinner as most men are. The only thing we don't do is we don't dehumanize men. So Cory Booker, and I did want to say that 1 out of 4 women has had an abortion. In most of the years following Roe v. Wade, there were 3 million live births a year and 1 million abortions a year. That number has changed over time, but that is averaging since it has been legal. Now, some of those women who chose those abortions may be immoral sluts, but it's very unlikely that all 1 million of them are immoral sluts. You know women, we have a really hard time being slutty. Most men get upset about that. If only we were a little more sexually alive. Maybe we're not sexually alive in those masculinist terms because we know what it means to have a child and to care for a child. Cory Booker, the really interesting senator from New Jersey, was on Krista Tippett this morning, and he said that one of his mentors had said to him that whatever you project onto somebody else is how you're really feeling about yourself. If you find yourself gossiping about so-and-so and such, it's likely that you're really talking about yourself. So what is it about the religious right that thinks that women are immoral, selfish, and slutty? Deserves consideration, I think. So, the long battle for the right to vote and what is now clearly the long battle for abortion rights come together, unfortunately, at the same root. It has to do with men dehumanizing women for reasons that have to do with their own moral and inner emptiness. Not all men, but enough of them. And clearly women join them as well in this way of looking at things. So here we are with what can only be described as an undue burden. A freedom we can't use, a bargain we can't access. And that language of undue burden does come from the Supreme Court. In the 2016 case, Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt clarified exactly what the undue burden test requires, and it was the Casey decision. Most of you know it. Casey requires courts to consider the burdens a law imposes on access to reproductive technology and to compare it with the benefits that those laws could confer. The undue burden comes when you could get a lot of benefit for a little cost. Today, the federal government is trying to force a gag rule on medical providers across the country to withhold information about where and how their patients can access abortion. It's going to make it illegal for a medical provider to tell somebody where to get an abortion. What kind of projection is that? That is an undue burden. And it has to do with some acceleration of emptiness and dehumanizing hate. So, back to the distressed wood. When things go on for a long time, some pieces of driftwood just rot. There are a lot of people who have been terribly injured by the gag rules that do exist already in some states, by internalized sense of, oh no, I can't possibly exercise this freedom, even if it's legal, because then I'll be damned and I'll go to hell. There is so much injury afoot, which is why we pick up the piece of wood and make sure the kids don't bang it up and make it any worse than it already is, and begin to tell a story about what happened in 1920. I hope it won't be till 2020, but it might be. But I think it's going to come sooner, as long as we appreciate the distress, read our Bibles, and refuse undue burden. Amen.